Hello, Good Hope. We come again, and where we are addressing questions that come to me and the other leaders in the church from time to time about things of the Bible or Good Hope. Now, recently a question came. I don't have the time to go into all the nuances of it, but I think we can cover it in a short amount of time, and it's a very real question that gets asked from time to time. And the question goes as such: what is the difference between a deacon, an elder, and a pastor? That is someone who's seeking clarity and understanding they want to understand the church a little bit better. Well, let me explain it like this. Through the ages, God has used different levels of servant leaders. Notice I use the word servant before the word leader. A servant leader, even in the Old Testament and in the New. And so he would use these servant leaders that would help shepherd and lead God's people in the direction that he wanted them to go. And so we see an example of this early. You may recall in Exodus chapter 18, it's verse 17 and 18, where Moses has led the Hebrew people out of Egyptian captivity. And so one day Moses is sitting on his throne, if you will. It could be his desk out in the desert, and he is listening to the people as they're bringing things to him. It said that Moses was sitting and judging them. He was judging the issues that were coming before him. Well, there were a long line of people, and Moses was getting weary. And so Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, came to him and says, "What are you doing?" And Moses explained, and Jethro said, "What you're doing is not good." Now, what Jethro was saying is not the action that Moses was doing, the way in which Moses carried it out. So Jethro gave Moses an example of how he can have different levels of servant leadership to handle the workload so that Moses was better able to shepherd and lead his people. So we see that in the Old Testament, even in the religious leaders. You would have the scribes, you would have the Pharisees, you'd have the Sadducees, you'd have elders, you'd have various leaders. So that carried over through the Old Testament. Well, in the New Testament, the early church started out with some semblance of that, but it was a little different. So when Jesus walked this earth, he poured into 12 men that he called his disciples. Well, Judas left, abandoned the team, but those men became his apostles. And so he poured into his disciples who became his apostles. So the apostles were the leaders in the early church. But as the church was growing and the ministry was expanding, we see a description, though they're not called that, but we see what we believe could be where the apostles realized they needed additional ministers, servant leaders, to help with the workload so that the apostles could be dedicated to prayer and the Word. So there were 7 men that they chose that were full of wisdom and full of spirit, that they ordained that they would be helpers to the apostles. We believe this would be a forerunner of our deacons. We see that in Acts chapter 6, and it worked very well. The deacons were ministers, not administrators. A deacon is not biblically called to be an administrator. It's not that they can't, but the biblical model is that they are ministers first. And so they would minister in caring for the needs of the widows and other people in the church. Well, as the church is growing, I would say probably around 15 years after Jesus ascended, we begin to see some more formation in the early church. So it's in Acts chapter 11, verse 30, that we begin to see the first reference to elders in the New Testament church. And in these elders would be appointed by the apostles. We also see in the book of Titus, chapter 1, verse 5, where Paul told Titus to appoint elders to lead the churches. And so now we're seeing early on deacons, now we're seeing elders, and elders are to be about prayer and the Word. And then we see a little bit later in Ephesians chapter 4 where we see a reference to pastors. It is a different Greek word, but it is a word that is used interchangeable with, say, shepherd or teacher or bishop or elder. And it's in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. I want to read this to you so that we understand what is being said here. So in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "And he," that is Jesus himself, "gave," that's a very important word, "some to be apostles, some prophets, and some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, that goes together. Why? Equipping the saints for the work of ministry to build up the body of Christ. So the office of elder is an appointment. It is an office. But a pastor is actually one that is given by God, by Christ, to the church. So the pastor is a gift to the church. The church isn't a pastor to the gift. The pastor is a gift from God to the church. We of course have to handle that humbly, but the pastor and the elder have the same character descriptions, just nuances in their function. So I have to serve as an elder, but I would be what in some churches you would call the teaching elder or the lead elder, though I serve alongside the elders in equal footing. So we do see different service areas within the church, but I do want to point out that the deacons, the elders, the pastor, we all work together for the health, the safety, the security, and the growth of Good Hope Baptist Church.